fascinating to know that this belief or this idea exists. And so what people have actually been waiting for is not a return of just Jesus Christ, right? Or a return of the Buddha, but a return of the Buddha and a return of Jesus and a return of Muhammad and a return of Ali and the return of all of the prophets and the messengers in opposition to all of the worst tyrants and criminals that have ever lived.
Wow. That's intense.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد الإمام المهديين وسلم تسليما. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. How are you, Tiffany?
I'm good. I'm good today. Thank you so much.
Good to have you back.
Thank you so much for having me here.
So today we wanted to talk about a very important concept, which is familiar to probably not so many people, and that is the idea of the return, or the concept of the return, or the raja, in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam.
Okay.
Okay? So in Judaism, we find that this concept shows up, and it's pointed out in particular in the New Testament. That's where we get kind of an insight into the thinking mind of the Jewish believer during the time of Jesus, peace be upon him. Yeah. Because they were, Jesus is asking his disciples, if you remember, he's asking them basically, what are the people saying about me, right? And what are some of the things that they said?
Some say Elijah or one of the other prophets, and some others say John the Baptist.
Yeah.
That's a particularly strange one.
So that is a strange one, and that we're going to talk about in specific in an episode about the transmigration of the soul. But let's talk about this expectation, or this talk that the Jews were having, that Jesus was possibly Elijah.
Yeah.
The idea that they thought that Jesus could have been Elijah means that they were already in a state where they were waiting for a return of Elijah.
Yeah.
Who was Elijah for the viewer?
Elijah was one of the Israelite prophets, and he was actually taken. It says that he was taken in a chariot of fire, so his body, it was understood that his body actually left the earth. So the Jews were actually waiting for Elijah to return, and the return of Elijah was supposed to be one of the signs of the coming of the Messiah. But if they thought that Jesus could have been Elijah, that's kind of curious, because they had known Jesus presumably since childhood, because he grew up in the area, they knew his parents, It wasn't that they thought this was the body of Elijah which had descended from the heavens. So it's a particularly strange conversation, and actually I never heard an explanation explaining this conversation.
Yeah, so basically what you're pointing out, I think, Tiffany, to the viewer, is the idea that, Elijah, he was taken up in a whirlwind. The Jews expected Elijah during the life of Elijah that he would show up again or come back. He never did. And they continued to have this belief many, many years after, because there was a lot of time between Elijah and between Jesus. And so the return of Elijah became one of these signs that was associated with the emergence of the Messiah.
Yeah.
They took him as a precursor, almost, to the return of the Messiah, and it means that you were also pointing out the idea that because they think that Jesus could have been Elijah, and yet Jesus was born, they were open to the idea of reincarnation. They thought that Elijah's return, or the Jews understood that Elijah's return in the end times would have been one of a rebirth instead of one of being coming down from the heavens in a whirlwind as he went up.
It seems to be the case from the conversation. That's really the only explanation that they seem to be believers in the concept of rebirth of the soul, that Elijah could come back in a different body. Or they also mentioned not even just Elijah, but one of the other prophets, that he would have been the return of one of the other prophets.
Jeremiah.
Yeah. So
that's really interesting now. So now they were expecting, they said that they thought that perhaps Jesus was John the Baptist. They thought that perhaps Jesus was Elijah. And they also thought that perhaps Jesus was Jeremiah. Mm-hmm. So now you have in Judaism this expectation of the return of many prophets in the time of the Messiah.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's extremely interesting and very not emphasized.
No, it's not emphasized. And then Jesus says something interesting, right, about who Elijah is.
Yeah.
What does he say?
You mean later on?
Yes.
He said that, like, he was speaking about John the Baptist, and he was saying that John, none of the prophets John was basically the culmination, the greatest of the prophets who had come. And he said to his disciples, if you will accept it, he is the Elijah who was to come. So he said that John the Baptist was the Elijah who was to come. We spoke about how Elijah, the appearance of Elijah, was supposed to be a precursor to the Messiah. And he said that already happened. And this was after John the Baptist was gone. And he said that this was the Elijah who was to come.
Now, you as a Christian, as a former Christian, how did they take it? How did they understand it?
So that's the issue. They don't have a satisfying explanation for it. They say things like, he came in the spirit of Elijah. He came forth in the same spirit that Elijah had.
Like doing the same things, like in the same sunnah.
Yeah, that he was like Elijah, and that he fulfilled that sign. Because they believe that Jesus was the Messiah, so they have to believe that the sign of Elijah coming was fulfilled. And of course they take the words of Jesus seriously. But they reject the concept of reincarnation. So the only way that they're able to make sense of it is just saying he's like Elijah. But Jesus didn't say that. He said he was Elijah.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So now we have the Jews. They're waiting for the return of Elijah, and not just Elijah, but also John the Baptist and also Jeremiah, and that means any prophet or messenger could have been waiting for his return. The mere idea that they think that Jesus could have been John means that they believe that return could happen in terms of rebirth. The other explanations are not so much convincing. And we find that being born out of this idea of the return that the Jews had concerning their prophets and messengers, we find that after the crucifixion of Christ, in the apparent, the companions, the Jews that followed Jesus, the disciples, began to have this expectation of a second coming of Jesus in the same way that Elijah had, or they were expecting that he would have a second coming.
Yeah.
So they believed that Jesus would come back again in order to fulfill the things that he basically did not fulfill in his lifetime.
Yeah.
That's interesting. And so do Christians believe that the second coming of Christ is going to be one of reincarnation or one of descending on the clouds?
Descending on the clouds.
Okay. All right. So now we have Jews and we have Christians affirming in their Bible that even though the Jews don't believe in the New Testament, but the New Testament also serves as a historical record of how the Jews in that time were thinking, right? So now we have proven that the Jews and the Christians believed in this concept of return.